Well, good to see you here, folks. We're expecting a few more people to come in. Here comes Zach right now. Good, Zach. Glad you could make it. Come and take a seat. All right. Just come and get comfortable. Settle in, folks. It's great to have you here. And it's nice to see you in one little area. It's really good. It makes it look a bit bigger as well. So, all right. I'd like to begin by welcoming you all to our church family. Some of you are from our family and some are from other places. I think we have some people from BCAC and some folks from St Peter's and City Point Christian College. So lovely to have you here. Settle in and enjoy your evening together with us. Creation and evolution in the classroom is a very important subject. And people young and old alike have many thoughts and questions. In 2018, we had a visit from Dr. Rochedale, who is another scientist from Creation Ministries International. And that talk was still spoken about around the place even these days. So tonight we're honoured to have with us Dr. Tas Walker. Dr. Tas is also from Creation Ministries International. And Tas holds a Bachelor of Science with Earth Science as a speciality. First class honours with that, a Bachelor of English also with first class honours, and a PhD in Mechanical Engineering. He's also a researcher, a writer, and tonight a speaker as well. So he does it all. So it's fair to say that Tas is eminently qualified to speak about this subject. And so we're grateful, very grateful, Tas, to have you here. So let's please make Tas welcome. And
thanks very much, Rob.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm a long way away from you, but I hope that's okay. It's not, I'm up here so I can use the microphone. I think that's the reason why I'm here. But I had a chat to some of you, which is cool. And so I'm going to be talking about creation and evolution. And just in the lead up to this, as I was preparing for it, I was under the impression that quite a number of you young people go to government schools and the issue of creation and evolution was an issue for you. But in the conversations, I find that quite a lot of you go to some Christian schools. Who goes to, is that St Peter's, a Lutheran school? Who goes to St Peter's? Is somebody who goes to St Peter's? No? City Point? There's quite a few go to City Point. So you're probably familiar with some of this stuff. But it'll be good anyway. It'll be good anyway. So there you go. So I'm going to be talking about Noah's flood, evidence in Australia. Come on in, young fine-looking faces. Come on, mate, take a seat. It's good to see you. Anyway, so I'm going to be talking about Noah's flood evidence in Australia. A lot of people, you know, the question is, did Noah's flood ever happen? Are the stories in the Bible, can they be believed? And in these days, of course, if you believe the Bible, a lot of people will laugh at you. I'm a geologist, and if I sort of talk about Noah's flood in geology, people will disappear out the room or they will laugh and that sort of thing. And it's very difficult to have what you might say, a conversation with people. But it makes things very interesting. I once went to a meeting of a university for the third age. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's sort of for people that are retired. And somebody in there got me to come along, and they really didn't want to have a creationist at their meeting. And it was very interesting. So it developed into a great big conversation, and then throwing questions and arguments at me. And after about 40 minutes, one of the guys said, I can't take this anymore. And he stood up and walked out, and everybody else stood up and walked out and got a cup of coffee. It was very interesting. So it's quite a controversial subject, and I just want to be able to give you some information and strategies for you being able to deal with this. So Noah's flood evidence in Australia, and wherever you go, you know, here's Western Australia, Point Perrin in Western Australia, you got the sign, and it says the 4,200 million year history of Western Australia. It's a long time, isn't it? 4,200 million years. And that's way beyond anything that the Bible ever imagined. And if you go to the Three Sisters near Sydney, it'll say something like 230 million years ago. And again, what's the Bible got to do with that? And that creates a puzzle for a lot of people as to where do you start believing the Bible? Do you have to take it on faith? Is faith believing something you're not sure is true? That sort of thing. And there's another one here, which is the the Glasshouse Mountains north of Brisbane. And here's a sign. People are looking at it, and it says something like the 26 million years ago, talking about it. So you're familiar with that. And a guy wrote to us, a young fellow wrote to us a number of years ago, and he was talking about the geology and this sort of thing. He says, a few months ago I started on my high school geology course. And a lot of people are really keen on science and keen on geology. And he said, and my faith was weakened by the evolutionary arguments presented in it. And so when you sort of encounter this stuff, it can weaken your faith if you come up through a church. And so basically we're going to talk about Noah's flood, and the relevance of it to you is basically it makes sense of the world. Once you understand Noah's flood, you're able to understand the world around you. So that's one good thing about it. The other thing is it makes sense of biblical creation. You can understand that creation is a real event. It's not a legend. It's not a myth. It really happened. And you can use it in some of your scientific research to frame your thinking. So that's the Noah's flood. And also, it washes away the millions of years. Noah's flood was basically a monstrous catastrophe. And so when they're talking about 4,200 million years, that's because they don't believe in Noah's flood. And so Noah's flood means instead of 4,200 million years, it occurred about 4,500 years ago. It's quite different. And the other thing that it does, it gives you confidence. Once you realise sort of how things fit together, it can give you confidence. And if you've grown up through and come up through City Point, I think you maybe have been exposed to a lot of this stuff, and so you might already have confidence. But I want to just talk about, first of all, about science in general. And I'm going to use paleontology as an example. And the joke I always make, I don't know if you think it's a joke or not, but I say when there's a paleontological secret, when a scientist digs up a bone of a dinosaur, it doesn't come up with a label on it, which says, I'm 70 million years old. What he does is he digs up the bone, and the bone, the fossil, that's the evidence. So we're talking about science, and it's always sort of put out that we are scientists, we deal with evidence, unlike you Christians who base your life on faith. You look at things which can actually be seen, real things, and you base yourself on a book, an old old-fashioned book. See, so that's the sort of thing. I don't know if you've had that thrown up at you, but I wouldn't be surprised if you had. But that's the evidence. You can see it, you can measure it, you can analyse it, all sorts of things. But this thing here is an interpretation. Nobody saw that. Nobody was there measuring that. There was no one there 70 million years ago checking it out and seeing it buried. And so that was not observed. And so really that's not, empirical evidence. And so where does that come from? 70 million years? It comes from a belief system. And that's the point, is that it's not, they don't tell you that's their belief system. They present it to you as this is a fact. You've got to believe it. It's a fact, and so that's the sort of way it goes. It's a lot of fun having discussions with people when they're, over this thing, because they can't see that they are basing their outcomes on a belief system, on a worldview. Another way of looking, and so the question I often, when you're at high school, and I don't know how many at high school or how many deal with this issue in your life, but I used to talk to my grandkids and I'd say, don't stress when you get this stuff. When it's presented to you in the class, when you read it in the textbook, don't think, the Bible's not true, and think, how you get stressed about it. Don't do that. You ask yourself, you don't have to ask the teacher, you can. I've asked the lecturer these sorts of things, what did they actually see? What did they actually see? See, they saw the bone, they saw the fossil, but they didn't see the millions of years. And here's another example of the same sort of thing. Here's the dinosaur fossil, an evolutionist looking at it, a creationist looking at it. They've both got different perspectives. That's the magnifying glasses, different perspectives as they're looking at it. And the evolutionist says, it's 1.5 metres long. And the creationist looks at it and he says, it's 1.5 metres long. How did they got the same answer? Did they cheat? No, they both would have used some sort of measuring instrument. So do you get that? See, it's the same evidence, they get the same answer because they're measuring it in the present. They're not going back in time to look at it, they're measuring it now. And then the evolutionist says, this is evidence for evolution. And the creationist looks at it and he says, this is evidence for creation. Two totally different conclusions. So where do they come from? They come from the belief system. They've got different perspective. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, is just looking at some geological evidence. I hope it's interesting for you. And also pointing to where you can get more information. So, and also talk a little bit about how we got here. So it's... And so it's a worldview. And again, the same thing comes up. You ask yourself, do you sort out what's true from what's speculation? You just ask yourself, what do they actually see? That's a very powerful question. When you're reading an article, when you're reading a textbook, when you're listening to a lecture, what did they actually see? Now, it wasn't always like it is today. If you go back a couple of hundred years, and I wasn't alive at the time, so I'm basing what I say on what other people have written. So basically, people believed they believed the Bible. And there's a book that I read called The Man Who Found Time, who talks about the change in thinking which occurred a couple of hundred years ago. And it's about a guy called James Hutton, who was a physician in Scotland. And it talks about what life was like back then. And it says, basically, everybody believed that the world was only 6,000 years old, not even 6,000 years old. All the different churches believed the same thing, the Catholic Church, the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, they all believed it. Not even 6,000 years old. And the scientists and the academics, they all believe the same thing. And where did they get that idea from? They got it out the Bible. They went through the Bible, looked at the genealogies, and based on a careful reading of the Bible, they came up with the conclusion that it was only about less than 6,000 years old. And even Bibles used to have the date. This is a picture of a first page of a Bible, maybe 50, 100 years old or something like that. And there it's got, right in Genesis, 4004 BC. And so that's the date, which was widely accepted in all sorts of areas. People accepted that. But it's not like that. Even Bibles today, they don't put that in the Bible. You know, if you buy a Bible, it doesn't have 4004 BC in it. And if you buy a commentary or on the Bible or something like that, they will be very reluctant to put a date on it because of the culture we live in. And there's Encyclopedia Britannica, the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's actually got a picture of Noah's Ark. An artist drew it, of course, and it fits with the dimensions mentioned in the Bible. So it was widely accepted. As a matter of fact, this guy, Nicholas Steno, was a pioneer of modern geology. Has anybody here studied geology at your university or high school or anything? Anybody do that? I'm not going to ask you any questions if you have, but that's all right. You've sort of done a little bit of it. Did you learn about the laws of stratigraphy? About how you can work out the relative ages of the rocks, as to the ones on the bottom are the oldest and the ones above it are younger and the ones above that are younger, and if there's something that cuts through the rocks, that's younger still. You know, so these are the laws of stratigraphy. Well, this guy, Nicholas Steno, is the guy that wrote those out. There are others as well, but he's the guy that developed the laws of stratigraphy back in I think it was the 1600s, something like that. And so he did a very careful work to discover that fossils are the remains of creatures which were once alive. They used to wonder what in the world these things in the rocks were. And he sort of made a case that their fossils are actually things which were once alive. And he developed he wrote a book about it, a small book. He intended to write a bigger book, but he never did. That's the way it happens. And these are the things that he came up with, the fossils once alive, principles of stratigraphy, and the geological history of Tuscany, where he lived. And he developed his geological history based on the Bible. And so oops, Daisy, I pressed the wrong thing, come back again. There's a button somewhere. There it goes. And if you go to university, you'll be learning the principles of stratigraphy from there. So the father of geology started with biblical history. So that's what it used to be like. That's what, and there are a lot of people who study geology, the pioneers of geology, like this guy, who used the Bible as their basis for understanding. So what happened was, well, there was a change that occurred, and that came with this guy Hutton, that this book was about. And 2 Peter 3, verse 5 and 6 says this. He's talking about scoffers, people who scoff at God, scoff at the Bible. And it says these scoffers say, deliberately forget that long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being, and the earth was formed out of water and by water. So what's that? Creation. Remember? God created the heavens and the earth, and it says the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And then God said, let the waters be gathered together into one place. So it says creation. They deliberately forget that God created. That's the culture we live in. Forgotten that God created this world. And it says, by these waters, the waters which were covering the earth, also the world at that time was deluged and destroyed. So what is that talking about? The flood? The global flood? The world at that time was deluged and destroyed. So these scoffers, these people that mock, and there are a lot of people on TV and on YouTube that mock the Bible, and you would have seen them, I'm sure you've seen them. This is what they say, is they mock that God created, and they mock that there was a global flood. You should see the number of books that, sort of heap scorn and ridicule on people who believe in Noah's flood. But Hutton came up with the idea, and this is James Hutton. He's a physician. And he was not very good at writing. His book was terribly boring. He wrote a book called The Theory of the Earth, and he published it in about just 1790 something or other. And in his idea, he came up with this. See, the geology we talked about paleontology, and geology is about rocks. You can study the rocks, you can look at the rocks, you can analyse the rocks, you can measure the rocks, you can draw the rocks. They couldn't photograph it then, but we can photograph them today because that's in the present. But you can't say how the rocks formed because we can't go back in time and see what they did. How do you figure out how they formed? Well, he comes up with it. That's the problem with geology. And a lot of people, the early people scientists used to say, well, geology's not a real science. Because for this reason, that you can't go back and actually look at what happened. But he says, well, this is the way we do it. The past history of our globe must be explained by what can be seen to be happening now. So we can't go back in time, but we can look at the rocks now. So we will look at the rocks now, and we will assume that it's always been like that. Does that make sense? That's a pretty smart move. And this is a philosophy, an idea that's sort of taken over geology. It's adopted it. And everybody, except creationist geologists, think in these terms. That the past history is just exactly like it is today. And so you can speculate and use what we see happening today about it. And so that's how it happened. And based on this, because they ignore Noah's flood, they ignore creation. Creation happened, boom, 6 days. That was quick, wasn't it? Didn't take millions of years. The flood happened, catastrophe, 1 year. So that wasn't long. All the rocks were formed in 1 year. And so, but if it's going to happen by things we see happening today, it's going to take millions of years. Millions of years. See, that's where the idea of millions of years came from here. And the guy writing this book, I think, is this him here? Deliberately forget Noah's flood. The guy writing the book said his ideas were really provocative and really upsetting for the people of that time because it basically cast doubt on the Bible, which it does, and it also put man right at the end of time, not at the beginning, like the Bible says. And so there were a lot of people that really didn't like this idea at all, but it's basically taken off. And so, you see, has anybody ever seen one of these? This is just a table showing the different types of animals which you find fossils of them, right? So you got the fossils which are modern at the top, but then rocks underneath them, you find dinosaurs, and then underneath them others. And geologists do this. They're fantastic at the way they look at the rocks and analyse them, and this is the evidence. This is what you can actually see. You go out into the field and you can see these things in the field when you travel around, and it's very interesting doing that. But look at the dates down the side. See that? 600 million years is down the bottom. So those dates, that's not observed, so that is a belief. So it's got the evidence and a belief on the one table, and that's what's confusing. And so again, here's just another example of that. Here's to go to the museum. I don't know if you've seen this in the Queensland Museum in South Bank. And this dinosaur fossil found at Muttaburra called a Muttaburrasaurus. And it's incredibly, an amazing dinosaur find. Has anybody been to see the dinosaurs of Patagonia? Has anybody been into the museum to see that? I took my wife for an outing. A date, and she very kindly came with me, and we looked at the dinosaurs of Patagonia. But look at this one. I won't go into the detail, but see this, what it says? 100 million years ago. So you got the date on it there. But when you sort of say, okay, what did they actually see? They see the bones, but they didn't see the time. So anyway, we stressed that enough. But when they put the 100 million years ago, basically that fits in with the evolutionary philosophy of how the world came about, and that is the idea that over millions of years, survival of the fittest, death and disease and suffering, it's brought about our existence. That's the idea of evolution. That's where it comes from that. And so basically, that doesn't work. If we're looking at it from a biblical perspective, that doesn't work, because the Bible says, just as sin entered the world through one man, I know his name. Do you know his name? His name was Adam. Adam and his wife Eve. He blamed his wife. But, anyway, it's another story. That's interesting one. You learn a lot about marriage out of the Bible. He entered the world through one man, and death through sin. So death came into the world through sin. And that's why sin is such an important thing, disobedience of the Creator. And that's why Jesus came. And in this way, death came upon all people because all have sinned. And so when we start with this picture, evolution, it doesn't fit with the biblical perspective. Whereas the Bible says death came as a result of a man's actions, disobeying the Creator. And so really it should say on this, it should say buried in Noah's flood. Okay? And so that's the sort of, I hope that's all right, looking at how it works. And that guy I told you about, Robert, his faith was weakened because of the geology ideas that he was learning at high school. And he says, a few months later for Christmas, I received a number of your books for Christmas. And he says, I must say that these books, as well as the website, have really been encouraging. And so, because it showed him a different way of how to look at geology, which is really cool. And so, some of the books he would have got, Creation magazine. Does anybody here get Creation magazine? A few of you do. That's a really helpful magazine. And if you're looking and thinking, I'd like to find out more, that's about a way to do it. And then there's a website, creation.com. So if you've got questions that come up in your studies at university, you can find lots and lots of articles about stuff there. And so understanding the scientific evidence for creation is good. And another way you can get helped is through the email newsletter. And so that comes out every week or two, something like that. And it gives you a digest of stuff. And that's very helpful. So that keeps you up to date. And if you'd like to keep up to date, that's a good way of doing it. So what we're doing, did I get that? Yeah. So what we're doing is this is an example of a Year 10 textbook on science, right? Science, Oxford University Press. And so this is very respectable. Would you say Oxford University Press textbook would be respectable? And so that's the thing is, like, we live in a culture where the institutions push this worldview and they don't really give you an alternative. And we're looking at an alternative tonight. And you've got this picture of the geologic column. Can you see that there? I showed you one of those. There's the geologic column. And it says, the history of living things as determined by paleontology. And if you, again, the dates down the side, what does it come to? 600 million years and that sort of thing. So that's in the textbook, the geologic column. But really, they only push it from the evolution perspective. What I want to do is show us how to look at it from a Bible perspective. And it's pretty simple, because Noah's flood is the key. And the Bible encourages us, always be prepared to answer everybody to ask you to give a reason for the hope you have. You're not just saying, oh yeah, well that's what I believe. You say, well, there's evidence for it, and it's really quite amazing, the evidence that you've got. And so you can give a reason, you can give some information to somebody if they ask you. But it says prepared. Prepared. That means that you have to think about it beforehand. Well, even just knowing creation.com, you're prepared. Because you can say, well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I can find out and I'll come back to you. So you're prepared. See how that works? Be prepared to give an answer. And so that's cool. And so here we got here. This is the history of living things. Now watch, I'm going to change it. So I changed the title. It says, The Burial of Living Things During Noah's Flood. So it's not the history, it's the burial during a 1 year. And then we've got this the ages along the side. We know that's a belief system, and we're looking at a different way of doing it. So we get rid of that for the moment. And so we change it to, this is the floodwaters rising, this is the floodwaters receding, and this is post-flood. It's very uneven, non-linear sort of distribution of the rocks and the fossils. And you can actually go to creation.com and you can get a geology transformation tool where you can look at anywhere in the world and you can see where it fits. So basically, so it starts with the flood. We read there that God said to Noah that he's going to destroy the earth. So build yourself an ark. And because he talks, it's a really very sad part. It really moves you when you sort of can see the sadness in God's heart as he decides to destroy the earth. And I just put up a picture of Noah's Ark. I think probably a lot of you have already seen this, about the size of it. Most people don't know the size, but it's something like 140 metres long, which is longer than a football field. It had 3 decks, higher than a 4-storey building, had a capacity of 15,000 tonnes. It was incredibly stable. So the Bible's not talking about a fairy tale. What it's telling us is eminently plausible. It would match the job that it had to do. And then we read how the animals came to Noah, 2 of every kind of air-breathing, land-dwelling animal, breathe through the nostrils, live on the land, and 7 pairs of some animals, the clean ones like sheep and goat and cattle. And so they came to Noah and they went on the ark. And so they've got the air-breathing, land-dwelling animals, including the dinosaurs, which is another story. And that's a question. I don't know if you have. What about the dinosaurs? Don't they prove the Bible's wrong? Well, the dinosaurs went on, and so they would have gone on, you see. And then we see there how the waters came on the earth, and it says, the Bible says, the waters rose greatly, and they rose and lifted up the ark until every high mountain was covered. And so we see that there's a lot of indication that it was global, it wasn't just a local flood. And we read there the other thing, that everything that had the breath of life in it perished. Birds, livestock, animals that creep on the land, cattle and people, everything perished. So what we're going to do now is saying, okay, we're going to look to see if is there any evidence that this happened. Is that cool? Is there any evidence? And so like in so many things in science, you have to sort of think about it and come up with the question of what evidence would you look for? That's what, anybody doing physics here? So, and that's one of the things you do in physics, isn't it? You do a sort of you postulate a situation of, say, there's a sphere which is a frictionless sphere, and another one sitting on the top, and it's running under gravity, and you say, just imagine the situation, and then you develop what you'd expect would happen from that. So that's what we're doing. And so Noah's flood, what would we expect to happen? And let's see if that's going to click across. Hopefully it is. What would you expect to find? Which is quite a scientific thing. Well, if you expect to find billions of dead things, buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth, from the land and from the sea. And so you do. I can only show a few. This is in central Queensland at Winton. The farmers find these amazing ammonite shells. And they're paddocks. There must have been water here sometime. They call it the Great Inland Sea. And there's another one, for example, you find this ankylosaur, an animal on with legs that lived on the land, had armour on it. And so you find this there. It's incredibly well preserved, buried, the details of its skin. You can see the ribs on it. And I think there's even a model of it outside a little tin shed up at Richmond. That's where it is. So animals living on the land and the sea, you'd expect to find that, and you find it everywhere. So that's one of the things you find. What else would you expect to find? Billions of dead things, but also you'd expect to find evidence of rapid burial. It was a catastrophe. You'd expect to find evidence that these things were overwhelmed. It wasn't just processes that we see happening today, slow and gradual. And so here's an example. There's lots of them. Here's a swimming animal. There are animals in the ocean. A plesiosaur up near Richmond, up in central Queensland. And farmer discovered the skull, and these people from the museum are excavating it. That's what paleontologists look like. That's what they're not wearing a white lab coat. And they're digging it out, and they said, there must have been a catastrophe here. Why would they think there was a catastrophe? Because it's so well preserved, see? And so if you have an animal die like this in the ocean, like a whale or something, it doesn't take very long before it's eaten by all the other animals, and it disappears. But you have to bury it probably to a couple of metres of sediment so that when it starts to rot, it doesn't pop out and float to the surface. So you're looking at a lot of sediment that's needed, and it's a catastrophe. And even the bones in its flippers were preserved. Incredible. So what would you expect to find? You'd expect to find evidence of rapid burial, and you find lots of evidence and lots of other stuff. Very exciting what you find. And you'd expect to find evidence that this flood covered huge areas. It wasn't just a little local thing, that this sediment and the things covered huge areas. And that's what you find. For example, here's some sediment, which is on Queensland, New South Wales, Northern Territory, and in South Australia. And so this is just some of the sediment that's there. And if you take a little X section through it, like there, cut through it, look, it's over 1,000 kilometres long, a very large area. And this is what it looks like in section. It's exaggerated 100 times. If you sort of made it proper scale, it'd be very thin, it'd be hard to see. And it goes down to 3 kilometres deep, 2 kilometres deep, 1,000 kilometres across the continent. It's like a continental blanket, a blanket covering the whole lot. So that's what you'd expect to find, things covering the whole of the continents. And that's what you do find. So you find sediment covering huge areas. And what else would you expect to find? Evidence of raging waters. We sort of talked a bit about this, but like here we got Uluru, Ayers Rock in the middle of Australia. And you just notice this great big rock sitting there. And I'll draw a line on it. See this line? You see how the sediment is sitting on an angle? It's layers of sediment which have been tipped on their end. It's sedimentary rock. And if you look at it from the air, basically, this is what it looks like from the air. You can see the lines going across it. I'm just waiting for it to change. Come on, change. There it is. See how it's like that? And you can see the lines going across it as well. So it's been tipped up on its end, and you can see the line there of this sediment. And when you look at the sediment, we could do a lot of talking about this, and there's a brochure about it, actually. You could get a brochure. Yeah, they are. There's some on the table. Uluru, so it talks about I'm only touching on a few of the things which are in this little brochure about Uluru and the evidence that it was formed during Noah's flood. And you can see the sediment. Some of the little grains are it's a little bit bigger than sand, but it's basically sandstone, and it's got a couple of different minerals in it. But notice some of the grains, a lot of the grains they're not rounded. Notice that they've sort of got sharp edges on them, which indicates that this stuff was washed into place quickly, and it wasn't sort of in a river or a stream, but it was sort of washed in a great big lump together and didn't have time to erode into grains to like that sort of thing. So that's Ayers Rock, and this is a picture of a cross-section of it. Geologists have worked out this section, and I copied what they wrote, but you can see Uluru is sticking up there, and you can see how it's been pushed around. Can you see how it's been pushed around? So it's like a bulldozer blade. Just imagine a bulldozer coming in and pushing the sediment, and it pushes it around and it goes up like that in a bulldozer blade. So it shows you something of the forces involved and the magnitude of it to produce these layers which are sticking up in Uluru. But if you go just down the road from Uluru, you see the Katachuka, which is the Olgas, and as you drive along you can see they're on an angle. You can see the layers of sediment in an angle. It's been eroded away, and you walk in between these, they look like heads. They look like somebody's head, great big head. And that's what Katachuka means. It means many heads. It's the Aboriginal name for these. And the amazing thing is, I was astounded. It's made of just these monstrous boulders, incredible boulders, have been washed into place. And you think, wow. And here's another picture of it coming up. Just to hold your breath. There it is. I'm sitting on just part of the boulders at the front, and you can see the one of the domes behind, and you can see these boulders are quite large, they're rounded. You can see the oblong ones are pointing in a certain direction, which indicates the direction the water was flowing. It's called imbrication. And so we look at there, and there's just powerful evidence for huge catastrophe in the middle of Australia. And nobody tells you about that. They wouldn't tell you about that at school. If you go and see it, they wouldn't tell you about that. You just say, wow, isn't that amazing? But they don't realise it's connected with Noah's flood, earlier in the flood than the Three Sisters. But if you evidence of raging waters, what else would you expect to find? Well, you'd expect to find evidence of massive erosion, the waters of Noah's flood going across the earth. And this is like the Three Sisters. Just look at how that valley has been eroded out. The Three Sisters are just an erosional remnant of the sedimentary layers which covered the whole area in the front and at the back. And if you look at the back, you can see how flat it is. Is that line there? See, it's flat. Why? How come it's so flat? Well, that's when the waters of Noah's flood covered the whole area. They covered the whole area and they eroded this thing flat. And they did it at various levels through the flood, but there's that. And then as the waters continued to flow down, and Noah's sitting in the ark waiting for them to go down, and he releases the raven and releases the dove, you know how it's happening. That's why this is happening in Australia. And you've got this great big, what is it? Come on. It's got this great big valley, wide valley. And I call it an overfit valley, because the valley's too big for the river, because it wasn't carved by the river, it was carved by a great big flow of water. So there's evidence of massive erosion. Here's another one. I think this is, anybody been up to Carnarvon Gorge? Has anybody been up there? No? Anybody been up the top? Did you go right up to the top? Did you go walk through the gorge? It's incredible. This is not the gorge. The gorge is behind these guys, but this is the outlook at the front of the gorge. And so again, you can see the flat surface at the top. See that? The flat surface. So this is one of the first areas to emerge above the floodwaters in Queensland. And you can see the flat surface there. And then you can see the erosion. You sort of, when you see it, you don't really imagine it. You know, geologists do. But, most ordinary people just look and say, isn't that amazing? Isn't that lovely? Isn't that a beautiful picture? But it's showing these layers of rock have been eroded away. And where's all the sediment gone? Did they have it in trucks? Were they taking it away in trains? Where's it gone? It was eroded during Noah's flood. And you can look at so evidence of massive erosion. We could go into more detail on each one of these, but I'm sure that what I'm doing hopefully is enough. What else would you expect to find? You'd expect to find evidence of youthfulness, that it didn't happen millions of years ago, that it was fairly recent, and you find that, for example, you don't really think about this until somebody tells you. But you've got, this is the Katachuka, this is the Olgas, the dome, one of the domes, and you can see how sediment has eroded and it's sitting at the bottom. Can you see that? And you can see there's a lot of fine sort of rocks, but there's also some big boulders lying down there, but not a lot. compared to the height of the dome. So there's very little debris there, really, if it had been eroding for 50, 100 million years. Not much debris at all. So that's an indication that it hasn't been eroding that long, because it was eroded by the waters of Noah's flood as they retreated. And same with the Ayers Rock, the Uluru. There's very little debris down at the bottom of the rock. And if you go there, you'll see that there are some broken pieces, but not much compared to if the whole thing had been eroded away. So that's indication that it's young. So there's a lot of evidence, and we could talk about some very fascinating things. There's a book, I haven't got a picture here, there's one on the table called How Noah's Flood Shaped Our Earth, and it deals with a lot of amazing stuff. But another evidence, for example, is these opals. You get the idea that opals take millions of years to form. And there was a guy who lived on an opal prospecting area in Lightning Ridge in New South Wales, and he had a little laboratory made out of tin shed, and he experimented for years, and was able to produce opals in a Vegemite jar. You get the sediment, you get the liquid, and within 10 days the opal colouring would appear as the silica sand would absorb the water, become hydrated, and it would change its shape into these little balls, and you get the opal shape. So we've just flicked through. What would you expect to find? Noah's flood evidence in Australia. And you'd expect to find all these things, and you do find them. And there's a guy, we get a lot of emails from people. There's a fellow who wrote to us, Matthew Shaw, and this is him here. He said, I've been reading creation stuff for years. It's a lot of fun, he says. So I presume he got Creation magazine, or his parents bought him books and that sort of stuff, because I've been reading it for years. And he said, I actually find that I'm acing Year 12 science, particularly biology and evolution. We're learning about evolution, and he says, I'm acing it. I'm getting top marks in the class because of what he learned in his creation books that he's read, particularly Creation magazine. And he says, it's a lot of fun. And he says, I seem to know more about... He made this post on our Facebook page, Creation Ministries Facebook page. And he says, I seem to know more about it than my teachers. Because I'm not talking about it tonight, but... the teachers don't know the difference between natural selection and evolution. They mix them up, and so it's very confused in the way they think, and he understands it. Anyway, so modern geology is a key. So this is what it'll do for you. And this is just one aspect. I'm not saying you should all become geologists, but make sense of the world, because it's part of history, the history of the world. It's a key part of the history, a different history from the secular history. It makes sense of biblical creation. So you understand that things didn't evolve, they were created, and the Bible records in the flood how they were destroyed. And then you realise that the flood, the catastrophe means it's not millions of years, and it gives you confidence in the Word of God. So once you understand it, you sort of... I don't know what you're thinking as you're listening to me, whether you sort of think, oh man, I'm not sure about that, this is a bit left field. Some of you might have already heard it and you're confident in it, but others, if it's new, you might think, I don't want to become, one of those cooks that, that believes this sort of stuff. And you've probably may have questions that you want to sort out before you basically commit yourself to saying, well, I do think it's true. And so that's why we bring along material so that you can find out. But the best one, simplest one, creation.com. If you're studying anything at uni or at high school and the questions come up, you can go there. If people ask you questions, you can go there. And there's that. There's the email use system, which is great. Now, if you're sort of thinking, well, I'd like to get a book, one book maybe, which actually would help me answer these questions. I got a lot of questions dealing with lots of things. Well, one of the best books would be the Creation Answers book. And so this answers most of the questions that people ask when they first hear about this. 60 of the most asked questions. And then, so there's that book there. And then there's another book, there it is there. There's another book, It's for kids, but it is actually for adults too. This is a book called, I think it's, what is it called? How Noah's Flood Shaped Our Earth. Come on. Why is it? There it is. How Noah Shaped. I talked about that. Once you understand that, I used to have people say, I didn't believe that Noah's flood happened. I wouldn't have even known what to look for. Now I see it everywhere. People tell you that, travelled outback Australia, in Central Australia. I could see the evidence for the flood everywhere. So that explains it. And there's another one for kids, but it's actually okay for any age, Exploring Geology with Mr. Hibb. So, but there's few of you get Creation magazine, which I think is good. Do you like it? Is it a good magazine, or you never look at it? It's a good thing to get into your home, to sort of have lying around, so you can just read it, and it's pretty easy. So Creation magazine is a great resource, and you can subscribe to it. You can get it out there. The people on the counter will have a form like this, and you can fill it out. And if you get a subscription today, I don't know, I think you look like you've got lots of money, like you're grown up. It's year 11, year 12, and probably got jobs. But my grandkids always keep asking me for money anyway. But that's all good. I'm happy to give it to them. But 1 year subscription, you get a free back issue. Looks like this. So that's to encourage you to get it. And a 3 year subscription, you get a back issue plus Creation magazine. So the time has gone, hasn't it? And I'm just finishing. The last verse is, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have. Now, I haven't talked much about the relevance, but it is a key issue. And if you start talking about your Christian faith, I wouldn't be surprised if people raise some of these questions. And so thank you very much for the privilege of sharing with you today.
Thanks,
Good
Tas.
on you.
Just before we let you go, is there anyone that has a quick question before we let Tas have his little break between? You can sing it out if you like, or I can come down.
These people are very shy if I ask them a question.
I was wondering, in your opinion, is it plausible that, given that the Gregorian calendar, which is used to measure time, was invented in the 1500s, and that the Bible's 7-day could be interpreted as a longer period of time, is it plausible, in your opinion, that the Earth is older than 6,000 years old, but human species are 6,000, and they were just created on the last day or on the 6th day?
Okay, so that's an idea. So that's one of the ideas is you have a gap theory. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then there was a gap of millions of years, billions of years, and then it says the earth was without form and void, empty, and so they said there was a catastrophe which occurred before the creation mentioned in Genesis 1. It's called the gap theory, but I showed you the issue with the dinosaur, and the dinosaur indicating that there's death and suffering before Adam and Eve sinned. See, so sin came in with Adam and Eve, death came in as a consequence of sin, and so if you're looking at it from a biblical perspective and just taking it as it reads, then you could not really accept that there was fossils and death before Adam and Eve sinned. But basically what you're proposing is a way, the evolutionary view, it's a trying to say we can believe the Bible and the evolutionary view together, and this is a way of trying to hold on to that. So it's a way of trying to incorporate the Bible within an evolutionary long age view, whereas if you just take it as it reads, you come up with a different perspective. Okay? Is that all cool? If you want to get the email alert system, the email newsletter, these will be at the table. You just email, that's all. It's free, and it's something for you. There you go. How are we going for time?
Yeah, well, we might close that there, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm happy.
What
is the time? Is it after 6:45?
Oh, almost. We'll have the adults or the older group come in shortly.
Yeah, these
are young adults, and they're wonderful. Thanks for coming, you guys. We really appreciate you turning up tonight. And you did really well, and thanks for coming again. Thank you to Tas. Give him a thank.